Hi, I'm Bradley Sumrall, curator of the collection of the Ogden Museum of Southern Art in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I'm here today in the studio of William Monaghan. We're going to have a conversation about his work. A little background on Mr. Monaghan: he uses industrial forms and fabrication methods to create paintings, like the one you see behind us here, that distort perceptions of depth and space, explore the role of objects in the authorship of art, and challenge our relationships with the unwanted and unnoticed remnants of consumer culture. Mr. Monaghan was instructed in the Bauhaus tradition at Yale University in the 1960s and trained in the studios of both Buckminster Fuller and William Wainwright. He began to incorporate industrial fabrication methods into his practice in the 70s when he established a studio and a sheet metal shop in Somerville, Massachusetts, and it remains a critical part of his New Orleans-based practice today. His work has been exhibited at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Massachusetts, Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in Connecticut, Boston Architectural Center in Massachusetts, Addison Gallery of American Art, Worcester Art Museum, the Contemporary Art Center of New Orleans, and of course the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, where one of his works are in the permanent collection. Right now, Mr. Monaghan has a 5-foot square, untitled construction that is part of the museum's permanent collection and included in the exhibition Built Sculptural Art from the Permanent Collection of the Ogden Museum, and that'll be up through July 25th of this year. So thank you for being here, or thank you for having us here today.
Thank you, Bradley. I don't think there's anything else to say after that introduction. That was comprehensive. I just wanted to talk a little bit about your work, how you got to this point in your studio practice, because I know there's a lot of background to it, and I've seen some of your earlier works that are phenomenal. But in an attempt to understand the work that you're making today, can you just kind of describe where this journey began? Perhaps like your early biography, personal biography, and professional career that kind of led you into this medium and this practice. Well, I was making art in the sculptor's workshop in Somerville, Massachusetts, with a group of very lively sculptors and painters, and I was gravitating toward objects which have always had a fascination for me. When I worked in the Portland sheet metal shop that you mentioned, I was so impressed with how these things were made and what the machinery could do, and was around all of these objects, which I started to both form for myself and gather to incorporate into paintings and assemblages. And I remember there was an early flag that I made where the stripes were made out of my clothing. This is one of the first of this kind. My clothing and things that I found on the street, and crushed cans and debris that was made out of steel, and then I put it outside, and it oxidized and created all of these interesting patterns.
What year was this when you were working with this oxidation?
Those early ones were in 1972 were the early ones, and many of those were actually big canvases, and then there would be big pieces of steel on them, creating fields of oxide, the oxide, which is of course always of interest to me, because that was one of the earliest pigments that artists had ever used. And so that was many of those early ones were steel angle iron, steel plate that I would cut and attach to a canvas, but then also things that I would find. So it's been a kind of a mixture of things that I made and things that I found.
So that working with the process of oxidation, that first came into your work in the early 70s, or?
That was in the early 70s,
and was there an art historical precedent to that inspired you to work in those materials, or did you come to it naturally, and then or did you discover a resonance with other artists, perhaps?
Yeah, there wasn't. No, I don't know anybody who has ever worked in this area. I'm sure there's somebody, but you know, I like Lee Bontekoe comes to mind, where you get those constructed canvas and steel, rusted steel, three-dimensional assemblages that I found so powerful. And then you had all the people who, like Thornton Dial. There was, at that time I didn't know about Agnes Varda, but there have been people who've been a direct inspiration, but they don't need lots of artists that have all of these sort of formal things that they've done that I find amazing. You know, like all of the colliding geometries that you'll see in many artists, or like Al Held. You know, there's all of these sort of unfinished vectors and circles that are cut off, and incomplete geometries that artists have, that I've found to be similar and interesting.
I think of the Arte Povera movement, and there are a few of those artists working with oxidation and evaporation as processes, and you were definitely right there in the zeitgeist of that, working in the Northeast with those processes. And then I think probably completely unaware of one another, there's also Jim McGee in West Texas, who was working with oxidation.
Yes, right.
And there's some real similarities in both of your early works, I believe, and but also singularity. I mean, you have the one thing I discovered about your work early on is that it has you know immediately that is a William Monaghan, which of course is the goal of every artist, to be able to have such a strong voice that it's recognizable. But do you feel that working with that living kind of natural process in collaboration with rust, with oxidation in those early years and in those early works, did that inform this more mature work in any way? And how?
Yes, the objects, the sort of fascination with the objects, and how they behaved, how they were made, and then how they made marks on the art, on the canvas. I did prints where, there's one over there, I did prints where I put metal on canvas, and then these deposits of iron oxide in sort of biomorphic forms would take shape under them and make completely unknown graphics nobody had ever seen before. It was always interesting to me how these objects could influence the art. So many times artists just kind of jam the art into what they want, which is, you know, the denial of the nature of the medium is a statement. You know, making a straight line, well, you know, paint doesn't want to make a straight line. Jackson Pollock, you know, used the liquid aspect of the paint in an expressive way, but that's, you know, that's another direction. But as I was thinking about these objects, I was also seeing the paint on the objects that I was making things out of, and I was sandblasting the paint off in patterns that were interesting and kind of looked shadow-like, and it was kind of making light. It was kind of making a painting. So that kind of made me think more and more about how the objects took the paint. And so way back in the 80s, I was making not this kind of finished a product, but I was working with paint and applying paint over these shapes because the objects took the paint and made these patterns. So here, this isn't a shadow. This is all paint. And so when I paint these things, the objects, as I use a airbrush or a spray gun, all of this application of white paint over this black base is because that's the shape of the object. And so the objects, as you mentioned, have an agency in the pattern that's displayed in the painting. So it's amazing. And then all of these little bends that are put into metal to make it stronger. If you take a flat piece of metal, it's very weak. If you put a little bend in it like this, it gets very stiff. It's those ridges that make things stiff. I was getting all of these paint patterns that I liked.
Well, it's interesting that you acknowledge the agency of the process with rust and the objects that are creating that rust, and you manipulate that and allow it in collaboration. And then when you're moving to this what most people would consider trash, and you're giving these objects new life, but you're also choosing these objects because they've already had a life, and that life has been discounted and discarded at this point, and you're bringing them back into a new narrative and a new life within your work. But you're also allowing those objects to have agency in maybe not just the way the paint lays down, but perhaps in the very composition.
Absolutely, and it's a kind of it's a fascinating thing, the geometry of, when I go to these recycling places, the geometries that are produced, these random intersections and collisions of all of these objects, quite dramatic. It's really, it's a kind of an exciting thing visually to look at. And you look at all of this discarded material, and I always think, well, I knew people who made things like that. And there's a kind of, I don't know, some restoration of the awareness or the dignity of the effort that went into making these objects that ought to be there. We buy this stuff from Amazon, we use it for a few weeks, we get tired of it, we throw it away, then it's embarrassing, we don't want to see it anymore, it goes into a dump. And it seems like, emotionally to me, a kind of an unfortunate loss of a lot of human effort and an acknowledgement of what these things are, how they were used. And you can see what happened to things. You can see that they were used and they were crushed by a truck, or they were worn out. All of this sort of history, this object history that's embodied in what you're looking at.
So this concept makes me think of other artists that are working in this collaborative effort with the material, and I think immediately of like the root artists, those artists from Howard Finster to Bessie Harvey to cane carvers, vernacular cane carvers, mostly African American tradition, mostly within Black vernacular art, that see kind of the spirit in the wood, and they try to coax that spirit out, and they're just there to help that spirit come out in the art. And I also think of like contemporary artists like Kristen Myers, who, much like you, looks for, in her found objects assemblages, she looks for proof of human engagement with these objects. She looks for that energy, she calls it. And she actually puts her work bundles it together and allows those energies to meld. And sometimes it's just a spiritual energy stir, but oftentimes it's also oxidation and the changing of surfaces and the colors with these things living together before she makes her object. So I love that. But also, let's talk a little bit about, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about light within your work. And there's a light through the painting process that kind of comes from within this work, and it's not from the lighting in the room. It's actually inherent in the work itself. And can you talk a little about what you're trying to achieve with that, and maybe is there any historical precedent to how you're working with light in the services?
Of course, light is a project of artists from all time. I guess the part of the definition of sculpture is the play of light on the three-dimensional surface. And so these really aren't sculptural in that I'm very careful to light these paintings so people can see them, so that the light is very flat, so that it's not interfering with the paint I put on the painting. So what you're seeing here is a black painting, and there's white and gray, a whole series of layers and layers of grays that have gone on here, partly because I like FSA photography so much that I always admired and envied those grays they produced. So in this case, it's a comprehensible sort of a light. It's coming from the top left. You can imagine that it's coming from the place that we expect light to come from, which is above. But it gave me the opportunity, not so much in this one, but in other paintings, to explore what happens, how do we perceive these things. And so many of my paintings, the light is coming from the side or below or somewhere that it shouldn't come from. Caravaggio comes to mind. The easiest for creating a somewhat alarming effect by having the light come out of the ground. And it's extremely difficult to look at these paintings that are done with the light coming from the wrong place. They actually, some of them tend to flatten out. They lose all dimensionality. They look like trompe l'oeil. They look like something that's printed on like a photograph or something. And so it gave me additional technique to develop some of these, again, artistic projects of all time, like 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, and light and volumes. So that's been an exciting thing to develop over the years.
Well, most artists that are working in this kind of visual trickery and visual illusion are trying to create the perception of three-dimensionality through a flat surface, through the painted surface. And you're doing exactly the opposite.
Right, half the time.
You're like a sculptor that makes their sculptures look like paintings often, and making a three-dimensional object look flat. And just the other day, I was giving a tour of the exhibition Built that your piece is included. Very similar piece to this one in grays. And, the people I was giving a tour just could not wrap their head around what happened from 6 feet away to 1 foot away, and they kept going back and forth to get that visual effect of flatness from a distance and then dimensionality when they get up close. So in the construction of these pieces, here's a question that is often asked. Do you create drawings for these compositions? And if so, are those sketches done with a stylus or are they done with the materials? And talk a little bit about that preparatory, that planning process.
Most of these were done from maquettes. Most of these were done as just a big table full of debris, and then arranged haphazardly, and they're usually done in a small size, 1 foot square, 2 feet square. And I kind of like a square format because I sort of feel like if you do a vertical format, there's some suggestion of a figure. If you do anything horizontal, there's some suggestion of a landscape. And so I like square because I want to indicate that this is just a piece of some giant surface that extends off into infinity. So I push these things around on a tabletop, and then I shoot them down, and I trim the edges until I find things that, and then I'll spray them, and then find things, or I'll spray them and then I'll pull parts off and put other parts on because things aren't working the way I want. But it is a more of a kind of empirical than it is abstract process. You know, I'm moving things around rather than drawing.
So if you're making the first composition at, say, 24 inches, how do you then scale that up to this size? And how do you find objects that match, or do you?
Well, sometimes I can find objects that match. Sometimes there are, there's a lot of little soup cans, and then they get bigger, but frequently they're not big enough. So if I have a painting like this, which originally that was a coffee can lid, and that sort of thing that looks like a cupcake paper up there, that was a bottle cap. So I obviously couldn't find anything that was a circle that was that big. And then I have all this experience with metal fabrication. So, and I like to understand how things are made. I'm actually in the Roebling chapter of the Industrial Archaeology Society. So I like knowing how these things are made. So I've developed the tools to actually make these things. So that's been fabricated. This piece here was on the original maquette, was a little tiny aluminum takeout food container that had gotten smashed. And so I made a great big aluminum takeout food container.
Okay. So you're not only using debris, discarded materials, but then you're fabricating
right,
new materials.
My own debris, yes.
Your own debris. Very good. So that said, your found object assemblages. What do you call these pieces? Are they paintings? Are they sculptures? Are they?
I think of them as paintings because really, many paintings have plenty of relief on them. And all you're really seeing is paint. If you take a picture of one of these things, it strangely looks exactly like the thing from a distance. And again, it has the confusion of 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, and has fooled, as you said, fooled a lot of people. I really think of them as, since you're looking at paint, you're not looking at sculptural effects. I think of them as paintings. You know, traditional bas-relief, you're looking at light and shadow. You know, those Nicholsons and all these cool WPA sculptures, and there's just a tremendous amount of really beautiful bas-relief, but that's a different animal because you're really looking at the light falling on it and outlining the forms.
Right. And you're just creating the light as well as some of the materials.
Yes, yeah, so I'm creating the shape and I'm creating the lighting on the shape.
Well, it's beautiful and powerful work. Thank you for sharing it.